she said it with a smile. Not a nervous smile. Not a grief-stricken smile. A satisfied one. The kind you only wear when you've already won, when the math has already been done, when the only thing left is collecting. My daughter, my firstborn, the one I drove to every piano recital, every college orientation, every apartment viewing in 3 different cities, looked at the attorney across that mahogany table and said, "He has nothing. We all know it." And the room agreed with her. I watched it happen. I was sitting right there, not 6 feet away, and the room agreed with her. My son-in-law nodded. My younger daughter, who hadn't looked at me directly in 4 months, stared at her phone. My nephew, who I'd paid 2 semesters of college tuition for without being asked, leaned back like the meeting was already over. Nobody looked at me. That was the part that stayed with me longest. Not the words. The direction of their eyes. I had become the kind of man people looked past, and they had decided that together, quietly, somewhere I hadn't been invited. What none of them knew was that a second envelope existed. And the attorney knew exactly when to open it. But I need to back up, because what happened in that conference room didn't start in that conference room. It started 4 years earlier, in a hospital hallway, when my wife of 31 years told me she wasn't going to make it, and I promised her I would handle it. I would handle all of it. She asked me twice if I understood what she meant. I told her I did. She knew our daughter. She knew her longer than I did, in the way that mothers know their children, not just the surface, but the architecture underneath. She looked at me from that hospital bed and said, "Don't let her rewrite the ending, Gerald." I didn't fully understand what she meant until 14 months later, when I was sitting in my own living room, in my own house, and my daughter was explaining to me, calmly, slowly, like I was losing my mind, that it might be time to think about downsizing. I had lived in that house for 22 years. Let me tell you what my daughter believed about me at that point. She believed I was 71, confused, financially unstable, emotionally fragile, and entirely dependent on the goodwill of the people around me. She believed that because she had built that version of me carefully, over about 18 months, the way you build a case, one small comment at a time, one concerned phone call to the right relative at a time, one slightly worried look at the right family dinner at a time. She told my sister I had been forgetting to pay bills. She told my doctor, my actual physician, that I had been repeating myself in conversations. She told my neighbor, Barbara, who has known me for 16 years, that she was worried about Dad, and left it at that, which is one of the most efficient sentences in the English language if your goal is to plant doubt without evidence. I was not forgetting bills. I was not repeating myself. I was grieving, which looks similar from a distance if you're not paying attention, and my daughter was paying attention to the wrong things on purpose. What she wasn't paying attention to was the folder on my desk. Or the attorney I'd hired 11 months before she started making those phone calls. His name was Raymond Ashcraft. He'd been recommended by my wife's estate planner, a woman named Carol who had known us since the 90s and who, when I called her 6 weeks after the funeral and told her I had some concerns, went very quiet on the phone and then said, "Come in. Bring everything." I brought everything. What Raymond and I built over the next several months wasn't complicated. It was just thorough. It was the kind of thorough that looks invisible from the outside, which is exactly how we intended it to look. My daughter was watching me for signs of decline. She was not watching for signs of preparation. That was her first mistake, and it was a significant one. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before any of that paid off, things got considerably worse. The downsizing conversation in my living room was not a one-time event. It was the opening statement of a longer campaign. Over the next several months, my daughter began appearing at my house with increasing frequency and decreasing notice. She would arrive on a Tuesday afternoon and walk through rooms I hadn't asked her to walk through. She would open cabinets. She would pick up mail from the counter and set it back down in a way that suggested she had read it. She brought her husband twice. He measured the back bedroom with an actual tape measure and wrote something in his phone. I watched all of this. I said very little. She took my silence as confirmation. That was her second mistake. She began what I can only describe as a soft reorganization of my life. She put herself on my pharmacy account as an emergency contact. She accompanied me to a financial review at my bank, something I had agreed to as a general checkup, and spent 40 minutes asking the advisor questions that positioned her as my primary caretaker and me as someone whose decisions might benefit from oversight. The advisor, to his credit, gave her a polite and non-committal set of answers. What he didn't tell her was that I had met with the bank's private client division 9 weeks prior and made several structural changes to my accounts that would take effect under specific conditions. She didn't know to ask about that. She didn't know that division existed, because I had never discussed my full financial picture with her. I had never discussed it with anyone in the family, actually. Not because I was hiding it. Because it was mine. Here is what my daughter thought she knew. I had a modest retirement account, a house with a small remaining mortgage, a social security check, and a savings account that I had shown her once, years ago, when she asked if I needed help. Here is what was actually true. I had spent 26 years as a silent partner in a commercial property group that my wife's brother had started in 1996. I had never talked about it at family dinners. My wife had known. Her brother had known. Raymond now knew. Nobody else was looking in that direction because nobody had ever thought to look. The properties had done well. Quietly, consistently, undramatically well. The total picture, when Raymond had laid it out in his office with Carol present, had made my daughter's. He has nothing. Comment not just wrong, but almost comically wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't feel funny until the right moment. That moment was coming. But before it arrived, there was the birthday party. My 72nd birthday. My daughter organized it. She organized it the way she organized everything during that period, with warmth on the surface and intention underneath. She invited family. She made a dinner reservation at a restaurant I like. She gave a toast. In the toast, she talked about how much I'd been through. She talked about how the family was rallying around me. She talked about how grateful she was that I had people looking out for me now. Looking out for me. At my own birthday party. My nephew raised his glass. My son-in-law said, "Here, here." My younger daughter wiped her eye, which was the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her in months, though I wasn't entirely sure what she was actually crying about. I smiled through the whole thing. What I didn't do was tell anyone at that table what I'd signed 3 weeks earlier. Raymond had called me the Monday before the party. He said everything was in place. He used the phrase, clean and unambiguous. He told me that when the time came, there would be no gray area. I told him that was exactly what I wanted. He said, "One more thing, Gerald, once this is filed, it's permanent. You understand that?" I told him I understood it better than he knew. 2 months after the birthday party, I had a cardiac event. Nothing fatal, a warning, my cardiologist called it, a significant one, but survivable with immediate intervention, which I received. I spent 11 days in the hospital. I came home to a walker I didn't need and a daughter who had arrived before I did. She was already there when the hospital transport brought me home. She had rearranged the kitchen. She had put a lock on the liquor cabinet, which contained 3 bottles of wine I'd been saving for no particular reason. She had left a printed sheet on the counter with my medication schedule, my appointment dates, and a note at the bottom that said, "Let us help, Dad. That's what we're here for." I read the note. I folded it. I put it in the folder on my desk with everything else. The next 3 months were the quietest of my life. I let things settle. I went to my appointments. I walked around the block every morning. I called Raymond twice to confirm that nothing had changed and that the structure was holding. He assured me it was. I called Carol once to confirm the investment accounts. She confirmed them. I did not call my daughter more than I had to. She called me every day. Sometimes twice. The calls were caring on the surface and investigative underneath. She asked about my energy level. She asked if I had spoken to anyone from my old business contacts recently. She asked once, almost casually, if I had thought any more about the estate conversation she wanted to have. I told her we could talk about it soon. Soon lasted 14 months. What ended it was a conversation she had with her husband that she did not know I had any awareness of. She had called him from my driveway one afternoon in October, apparently assuming I was asleep inside. I was not asleep. I was in my reading chair next to an open window, because I preferred fresh air to the heating system that October, which my daughter had never learned. I heard enough. Enough to know that the timeline she had in her head was no longer hypothetical. Enough to know that she had already spoken to someone, not Raymond, someone of her own, about the process for contesting an estate under mental incapacity claims. Enough to know she had been building something in parallel, the way I had been building something, except hers was pointed in the opposite direction. I sat in that chair for a long time after her car left the driveway. Then I called Raymond. I told him what I had heard. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That changes the filing sequence. Are you ready to move?" I told him I was. He said he would make 2 calls and set a date. The date was a Tuesday, 11 days later, at a law firm downtown that was not Raymond's firm, which was intentional. Raymond had suggested using a neutral firm for the reading, a firm with no prior relationship to any party, to ensure that what happened in that room could not be characterized as procedurally irregular by anyone who might want to characterize it that way later. He had thought of everything. That's what I'd paid him for. My daughter received a formal letter informing her that the estate planning documents her father had prepared were ready to be reviewed, and that her presence was requested at a scheduled meeting. The letter used language that was calibrated, specific enough to seem routine, vague enough to leave her no useful information about what she was walking into. She arrived at the meeting room with her husband. My younger daughter came separately. My nephew, who had not been personally invited, came anyway because my older daughter had told him to, which told me a great deal about what she expected to receive that day. I arrived 7 minutes late, which was intentional. When I walked in, the room felt like what it was, a room where people had already started deciding how to divide something. The attorney, a man named David Park who I had met once before and who had the excellent professional quality of revealing nothing through his face, stood when I entered. My daughter smiled at me the way you smile at someone whose role in a meeting is ceremonial. She patted the seat next to her. I sat across the room instead. David began with the procedural overview. He explained that this meeting concerned the review of estate documents prepared by Gerald Thomas Whitmore, me, and that the documents had been filed through proper legal channels and were binding under state law. He used several more sentences of that nature, the kind that sound like legal weather forecasts, and I watched my daughter's face move through mild impatience into something more focused as he kept talking without getting to the part she was waiting for. Then he reached into the folder. He produced a document. He described it as the primary estate planning instrument, finalized 14 months prior. He read the relevant sections. He described, in general terms, the distribution structure. He named figures. My daughter's expression did not change much. I think she had expected something modest. What she heard was not modest. I watched her recalibrate in real time. I could see her doing the math, adjusting the model she'd had in her head, arriving at numbers that were larger than what she'd assumed but still, in her mind, manageable. She started to say something. I think she was going to express appreciation, or possibly ask a clarifying question that would begin the process of positioning herself as the primary executor. David spoke first. He said, "There is a second document." The room did a thing I've never seen a room do before. It didn't go quiet, it was already quiet. It went still. There's a difference. Quiet is the absence of noise. Still is the absence of movement. Everyone stopped moving. My son-in-law, who had been writing on a legal pad, stopped writing. My nephew, who had been looking at his phone under the table, stopped looking at his phone. My younger daughter lifted her head. My older daughter, the one who had arranged my birthday toast, who had reorganized my kitchen, who had stood in my driveway talking about contesting my estate, looked at the envelope in David's hand with the expression of someone who has just understood that they made a very serious mistake somewhere, but cannot yet identify where. David did not make her wait long. He opened the envelope. He removed the document. He read the first page identifier aloud, the date, the filing reference, the legal classification, and then he looked up once, briefly, for no particular professional reason, and I thought I saw something flicker in his expression. Not satisfaction. Something more contained than that. He began reading. The second will was not complicated. It was, as Raymond had promised, clean and unambiguous. It addressed the specific situation that had developed over the preceding years with a level of precision that I think surprised even David when he'd first reviewed it. It named conduct. It named timelines. It referenced the pattern of actions taken to undermine my legal autonomy and misrepresent my mental and financial state to family members and medical professionals. That last phrase landed like something dropped on a stone floor. It didn't bounce. It just sat there. My daughter opened her mouth. She did not produce words immediately. Her husband put his hand on the table, not on hers, on the table, which I thought was a revealing choice. My nephew looked at me for the first time that morning with what appeared to be genuine confusion, as though he was meeting a person he thought he knew and discovering the dimensions were different. David continued reading. The structure of the second document was straightforward. Under the conditions described, conditions that had been met, documented, and verified through a combination of testimony, recorded communications, and financial record review, the distribution outlined in the first document was superseded. The estate, in its entirety, would be directed through a managed trust, administered by Raymond and a co-trustee I had selected, with distributions allocated according to a schedule I had designed and that could not be modified by any party named in either document. My older daughter was not named as a beneficiary in the second document. She was named in a different section. David read that section with the same flat, professional calm he had used for everything else. It described the documentation of conduct that had been compiled and preserved. It described the legal options available to the estate in the event of any challenge. It described, in plain language, what contesting the document would trigger. She had spent 14 months preparing to contest an estate. The estate had spent 14 months preparing for exactly that. The math on that, when it settled, was not good for her. She looked at me. I don't know exactly what she was looking for. Guilt, maybe? Or some indication that this was negotiable, that the version of me she had constructed, confused, fragile, dependent, manageable, was still available. That the man who had sat quietly through the kitchen reorganization and the birthday toast and the medication schedule left on the counter was the real version, and this was a mistake. I held her gaze. I didn't say anything. David asked if there were questions about the document's contents. There was a long pause. My son-in-law asked one procedural question that David answered in 2 sentences. My nephew said nothing. My younger daughter, who had been largely silent through the entire reading, asked if she could have a copy of both documents. David said copies would be provided to all parties. My older daughter asked if she could speak to me privately. I told her that all communications going forward should be directed to Raymond. She said my name? Just my name. The way you say someone's name when you're trying to remind them of something, of who you are to each other, of the history that supposedly means something, of the claim that family is supposed to give you on a person regardless of what you've done. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. I told David I'd be in touch. He nodded once. I walked out of that conference room without looking back. In the hallway, waiting for the elevator, I could hear my daughter's voice rising slightly behind the closed door. Not the words, just the register. The sound of someone explaining to a room why the outcome should be different, why the documents should say something other than what they say, why she should be treated as an exception to the record of her own behavior. The elevator opened. I stepped in. On the drive home, I passed the restaurant where she'd held my birthday dinner. The one where she'd given the toast about the family rallying around me. The one where my nephew had raised his glass and my son-in-law had said, "Here, here," and my younger daughter had wiped her eye at something I still don't fully understand. I had been sitting at that table knowing exactly what I'd signed 3 weeks before. I had smiled through every word of that toast. I had thanked her for organizing it. I had ordered the fish because I wanted the fish and because I was a free man in full possession of his own mind, his own property, and his own plan. I had known, even then, that the envelope existed. I had known who would open it, and when. I had known that the room would go still. The only thing I hadn't known, the only variable I hadn't been able to predict, was the exact look on her face in the moment between hearing, "There is a second document," and understanding what that meant. It lasted about 11 seconds. I've thought about those 11 seconds more than I've thought about most things. Not with satisfaction. Not quite. With something more like clarity, the feeling you get when something you've known for a long time is finally visible to everyone else in the room. She had told the lawyer I had nothing. She had been wrong for 4 years, and she had been wrong in that room, and the record would reflect that permanently. The documents were filed. The trust was active. Raymond had 2 decades of experience ensuring that things filed and active stayed exactly what they were. There was nothing left to contest. There was nothing left to reorganize. There was nothing left to manage but the life I had been living quietly, carefully, and entirely on my own terms, while a room full of people looked past me and saw exactly what I'd needed them to see. My wife had told me not to let her rewrite the ending. I didn't.